Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Paul Musgrave. I'm with the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. It's April 16th. We're in Washington, D.C. at the offices of the Grocery Manufacturers Association. I'm with Pamela Bailey, whom I have the honor and privilege of interviewing for the Richard Nixon Oral History Project. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Let's start off. When you're in college, how do you get the internship to go to the White House for the summer?
I was a political science major at Holyoke College, and I had chosen the major in the college because the school had a history of providing interns directly to the White House. I had worked the previous summer in the pre-convention, pre-nomination Nixon campaign in Pennsylvania, and as a result had gotten to know Jamie Humes, who became a speechwriter when the administration took office in January. I was also one of the few Republicans at Holyoke College in that day. So I think a combination of default and knowing someone in the White House, I came to visit spring vacation and was introduced to the head of research in the speechwriting office, Celia Bellinger, who loved the notion of a free worker bee. And that's how I got my internship.
What did you spend your time doing?
It was fascinating. We worked and were on the hall with the speechwriters, who included Pat Buchanan, Bill Sapphire, Jim Kehoe was head of the office. I'm trying to remember who else was there at that time. But what we did was the news clips every day. We maintained files. The speeches had to be based on primary source information. We had all of those resources within the offices, so keeping those files on a daily basis up to date and current was important. But one of the things I did was gathered research for a speechwriter before a speech, presidential remarks, a trip, if you will, were put together. So we provided the original research, and then once the speech was written, verified facts. My supervisor in the office was very small. It was Celia Bellinger, who'd been trained in the Time magazine research technique, head of the office, and there was assistant Maureen Brown, and then there was me as the intern. So I got to have a lot of interaction with the speechwriters, a lot of interaction with others in the White House, and responsibility, pulling material together, and then she'd let me verify facts. She was very much in charge, of course.
Was there a higher standard for doing research there than at Mount Holyoke?
The research we did was the highest standard I can imagine anywhere. It was very clear. If you're checking facts and providing information that's going to come out of the president's mouth or through his name, it has to be perfect. That was the standard. The other thing about the internship, and I don't know if you've come across this in your work, is that the Nixon administration had a summer internship program that was very formal that year for college students, and it was a terrific experience. We met directly with cabinet members all over town. It was a very, very rich, educational, complete program, and I think they even had a special office staffed to do nothing but organize and run the internship program.
What was it like? I mean, obviously this is kind of a turbulent period out in the wider world, and you're at the eye of the storm.
Well, remember, it was the first year of the administration. It was not as turbulent as it would become later when I was working there and we had troops housed within the building, for example. There was still a lot of excitement, and we had the run of the place. I remember just walking over in the West Wing. I had a friend who worked for Pat Moynihan, going into his office. People could eat their lunch on the front lawn of the mansion. I mean, it was a very open, very different era than it is today.
Were you there for the moon landing?
Yes.
What was that like?
I'm trying to remember where the president was at that point.
I think he was actually because he makes the phone call from the Oval Office, right?
Yeah, yeah. We must have been involved in that because, again, we had to verify anything that would have been prepared in advance for him. I remember that more, not because it happened at night, and I wasn't in the office. It was something as a college student watching with my friends and fellow interns.
It's just the speechwriting office has, there's this famous speech that was never delivered, the Sapphire speech, in case of emergency, if the landing had not gone well.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And so there's all these interesting documents that the office had prepared, in case of a successful landing, in case of something happening on the way.
Interesting, yeah, I didn't remember any of that.
Okay. You go back to school, you graduate, and you're asked to come back to join the Agnew shop.
That's right.
What was that like?
That was very interesting. I came aboard in the fall, in the midst of the campaign. Bill Sapphire was writing a lot of the speeches for the vice president at the time. And so while my office was in the vice president's set of offices, I remember working directly with Bill on a number of speeches, including some of the famous Dr. Spock ones. I think it's fair to say I verified facts in terms of quotations. I'm not sure I was sophisticated enough to understand the context with which they were always being used, but it was that was quite controversial.
It was a really high-profile time for the vice president.
Yeah, it was very high profile.
And some of the phrases from that campaign have come down into history.
Nattering nabobs of negativism. Yeah, I remember thumbing through Dr. Spock books, verifying quotes. Thought about that many times when I raised my children and used Dr. Spock for other purposes.
Not trying to, go after the
That's
lib
right.
dem, no, the radical libs.
That's right.
Yeah. How do you go from that to the permanent assignment? Because that's in 71,
Yeah.
right?
Well, the working in the vice president's staff was not an easy situation. It was a relatively small staff, some fairly volatile personalities. I've always felt, and that experience confirmed it, vice presidents ordinarily don't really have day-to-day responsibility. So I think as a result, sometimes staffs can reflect that uncertainty of purpose. So I was glad when the White House Research Office was gearing up at the end of 71 into 72 for all of the work it was going to do during the 72 campaign. So Seal Bellinger, who I'd worked under as an intern, asked me to come back and wanted a commitment that I would be staying through at least the 72 election. So that was certainly what I was glad to do. And then that was fun. I mean, one of the first things I remember working on was the president going to China. And I've been to China many times since on business and have never forgotten the wonder and the awe that we all had that the president was actually in China. So a lot of speeches, a lot of work all through the campaign, working then with the surrogates. The speechwriting staff got beefed up. We brought a number of new writers on. And then we worked on writing speeches not just for the president, but also for the surrogates, which included the family.
Did you work with the Office of Public Liaison on that, or did things just come to your desk?
They came directly.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the things you have to remember about speeches in that era too is that you didn't have computers. Every speech that left had to be perfect, and that meant no typos. They had to be typed over and over again, and so many nights we'd be there literally all night. State of the Unions are a good example, and Dave Gergen has a great story to tell about how he evolved the use of the State of the Union from a speech to also a written document. And we'd be there waiting for watching the sun come up, finalizing these documents. And one of the things the researchers had to do was sit there at the desk of the assistant who was typing the final draft that would go to the president and proof it. And if one word got changed, the whole thing had to be retyped over again.
Excuse me, Paul.
Back and forth.
None of that.
Right.
None of that. Okay, I'll tell you how we did it. Yeah.
Okay.
It was very interesting.
So, I mean, let's get into this research question a little
Yeah.
bit, because how would you, I mean, you mentioned the Time magazine method. How do you fact check the president's speech in 1971,
Right.
1972?
Right. The first thing you do is you go through the draft and you put a check mark above every fact. And you have to train yourself to be very clear, to take nothing for granted. Nothing. Date, reference. So that's the first discipline. Then you have to find a primary resource for every one of those facts you've checked. Our sources included our own files, which might be newspaper clippings, encyclopedias, which is an old term today. CQ, Congressional Quarterly, had fact books. So we could use what were considered primary sources that we had within the office. Speechwriters can be very creative about facts. And Bill Safire was one of the most creative, and I think you've seen his interest in language throughout his whole career. So sometimes he would have special books, and you would have to pull out of him where he thought he had gotten this fact or whatever. Another resource was I'm trying to remember when OMB was, it used to be the Office of the Budget, Bureau of the Budget,
Bureau of
BOB.
the Budget, right.
BOB on the fourth floor of the old EOB had a library, and it had microfiche. So we could get New York Times microfiche, and I became quite adept at that. There was also the Emergency Preparedness Library. On the other end of the EOB, I'm assuming it's still there in some way. Beautiful old library. All sorts of books in there. So you would go in and consult with a librarian and try to find the right book. The other thing we had to do when it came to policy statements was get a source from the Cabinet Department or the Domestic Policy Office or whoever in the White House was responsible, National Security Council, or OMB. And that's where we had to play the role as the arbitrator often. The speech, if it were a policy speech, would be circulated to all the relevant cabinet departments and White House offices, and then you'd get comments back. Now this was all by paper, once again. Messengers would bring them into you, and then you would sit there and have to see who was saying what. I think it's fair to say we learned early on if there were a difference of opinion, in most cases you would let OMB work with you as the arbitrator. For national security, of course, we had a contact in the military and the National Security Office we worked with. So it was, again, getting a name who would take responsibility for that fact, and you would footnote every single fact with the primary source that you were relying on to verify it.
And this would be, if it were a national security issue, you would call up Al Haig, someone on the staff?
Not Al Haig. I'm trying to remember who our contact was. No, someone on his staff. And there were people, for example, the Vietnam War or Cambodia, up in the NSC that we would work with. So there was always somebody that we had as our liaison.
So it might be somebody like Hal Saunders for Middle East.
Yeah,
like
Al
that.
Saunders. I'm trying to remember the one on Vietnam, but that's right. And then Brennan.
Jack Brennan?
Jack Brennan in the military aides office. Yeah.
Was there ever an instance in which the system broke down?
I made a mistake once. It's the only one I can remember. Julie Nixon was giving a speech, and for some reason, and the speechwriter had referred to the senator. It was a national seashore in Indiana that was being dedicated. Maybe Vance Hartke.
I'm guessing it was probably Vance, yeah.
And the speechwriter had referred to him in the text as the late senator, and I had not verified it. And somehow she was on her way to give this speech, and it suddenly hit me. And I told Dave, I've killed off the senator and he's not dead. I mean, this was horrible. No cell phones. Think about it. No way to contact people. And she delivered the speech, I think, referring to him as the late. That was devastating. devastating to me. That's the only time I can remember ever having done something like that. But the responsibility, again, is not the speechwriters, it's the researchers. Speechwriter can be creative, the researcher is the one that's to verify every fact.
And this president liked to give a lot of extemporaneous speeches, right? He didn't always work from a prepared text on Rose Garden type statements.
If it were a Rose Garden statement, we would have prepared a text. In fact, I think my impression from observing later presidencies is that we may have generated more remarks than is common today. Messages to Congress is an example. That device as a way of proposing and advocating and explaining a policy idea. The message to Congress, I don't think they do those anymore.
These are the written messages, things like the
Yes.
blessing statement and
Yes.
so forth?
Yeah, and if you look through the history of the Nixon presidency, that is where innovative ideas were first advanced. And it was a real communications device. I don't see those anymore.
Well, this is why it was called the Research and Writing Department, not the Speechwriters Department, right?
Right.
What was the campaign like in 1972 from your vantage point? Was there an uptick? You mentioned that you did a lot more with surrogates than you might have expected.
Right.
The president didn't say a lot as a candidate. He preferred to speak as president that year, correct?
I guess you're right. I'm not sure I ever thought of it as a strategy like that, because we had the entire family was out speaking, and then there was an emphasis on other appointees, and really using, I think for the first time, a much broader base of advocates for the president rather than the president himself. So for us, it just meant a list of speeches every day, every week, for months. And the speeches had to be generated on a timetable, written, fact-checked. The research, the material had to be done. We had to write a fact sheet, pull together a fact sheet and write it up for every speech in terms of what the audience, what the venue is, the audience, the topic, if you will, if it were a dedication or a particular venue. So it was a lot of work. It was a lot of very late nights and for months on end.
And you would also verify the talking point statements, correct?
Yes.
Just so we can move a little bit farther into 72, 73, as Watergate began to be more prominent, who was your contact to double check, the facts that the president was saying about Watergate?
I don't remember at what point the lawyers entered it all, but there were lawyers detailed to the White House from the Justice Department.
Richard Hauser and guys like
Dick
that.
Hauser, and I remember working a lot with them. Yeah, we always worked with Fred Fielding and John Dean. They were just down the hall from us, and then we worked just with Fred Fielding. I thought about that. Our resources were really the lawyers, and what happened with the speech when it left our office and went over to the president before it was delivered is something I was never clear about. And I think if you look at history now, there were obviously modifications made. I mean, we were clearly in the dark.
Mm-hmm. Just procedurally, did things go through the staff secretariat, or how did materials leave your shop and actually arrive at the Oval Office?
Yeah, good question. I think it was, who was the staff secretary?
Oh, I think you would have started with Huntsman.
Yeah.
There's 4 or 5 of them. That's got to be the
and
hardest
now I'm
job.
thinking of Dick Norman, who had that job in Reagan.
Right.
I don't remember exactly, but it went somewhere. For our purposes, it went.
Right, right. And then you just watch the delivery to make sure that you hadn't killed off Archibald Cox,
Yes.
for instance.
Yes. Oh.
When do you get picked to go over to the domestic council? When do you know that that's in the pipeline?
Yeah. I had worked with Jim Kavanaugh, who handled health care on the domestic council, in the course of verifying speeches, as I had worked with a lot of people in the White House. And he was at a point where he was able to hire a staff resource. At that point, I was ready to make a move. My recollection was spending a lot of time in a conference room looking at San Clemente security procedures with Secret Service people so that we could explain why the improvements were made. And I was, at that point, Watergate was really closing in.
This is the new pathway, the new the communications posts, the things like that, right?
Yes, and where the windshields were put up, and was it a windshield or a security device, and it was becoming a very different environment at that point. So I was very pleased to have this opportunity to move up there, and I was given responsibilities for health, welfare, aging, social security, and consumer policy, none of which I was an expert on. And I distinctly remember the day Jim showed up at the door to my office and said, "You have health care." So my role clearly was as a liaison with the cabinet departments that were involved, once again working very closely with OMB, but also having responsibility for writing decision memos and summary memos directly to the president on these issues.
Henry Kissinger has a line, I was just looking at this in his memoirs the other day, that says that good bureaucrats would always write a decision memo. So you'd have option A, which would be surrender, option C would be declare war, and option B would be negotiate. That, you know, basically, if you wanted to keep the bureaucrats happy, always check the option in the middle. Did you ever do something like that? Was there ever...
Well, first of all, would not ever to presume that any memos I wrote were of the magnitude of what Henry Kissinger might write. And I'm sure we did not write, these were domestic policy decision memos, not national security, so America can rest assured. Those were in his hands. But I was very conscious of the responsibility of being balanced. There was a recommendation as to which way the president should go, but it was always backed up with reasoning, and it was always, my recollection is it was always coordinated with OMB, so that it was a coordinated response, recommendation from the Domestic Council and Management and Budget.
And you're working with guys like Paul O'Neill, I assume.
Paul O'Neill, exactly. Yeah, very, very wise man.
Now, tell us a little bit, because you're there before OMB becomes OMB. And OMB and the Domestic Council are two really important agencies within the Executive Office of the President, within the White House complex. What was OMB's role? Because you mentioned before that if there's a dispute among cabinet agencies, you'd go to OMB to let them arbitrate. As you moved over to the Domestic Council, did you get a different perspective on how OMB fit into the policymaking process? At that time, my recollection was that the two worked almost seamlessly together. So that if policy were being developed, there was very clearly the expertise and the budgetary implications. But the policy expertise and the people that worked there were grounded in understanding government policy, government practice, where improvements could be made. And I think to this day, OMB is still extremely professional and highly respected for that. As much as I may have had a different perspective later when I was in the receiving end in the cabinet department, you can never dispute their knowledge and their expertise, and I think in many ways their impartiality. Any one of us that was a political appointee could never have that depth of understanding. Were there differences of opinion? Yes, there must have been, but I think at that point Paul O'Neill really functioned as a co-equal and trusted colleague with those of us on the Domestic Council. Well, what's it like working on domestic policy in 1974 as things are starting to heat up on the political side? Because the presidency did not stop.
That's right. And in fact, we were very focused on ensuring that it did not stop and that the sense of momentum and the sense of attention to the nation's business continued. And so I remember during that time period writing a memo recommending a series of policy initiatives and events, cabinet briefings, press briefings. There were a lot more briefings and going out and talking to the media after a lot more cabinet meetings too. Healthcare was a big issue. We had a task force on national health insurance that was, I staffed, and the principals included Alan Greenspan, Bill Simon, Secretary of the Treasury, or now am I going into Nixon, into Ford?
No,
Okay, thank you. Cap Weinberger. And this was all taken very seriously. Now you've got to remember, I'm only a few years out of college. My life experience is limited. If I were in that situation today, would I be more aware that the world was changing around us? I don't know. At that point, and I think in some respects it's the only way in these jobs in Washington when there's a lot of controversy, it's the only way you can approach your job is just keep your head down and do what you're supposed to be doing and focus on that and try to block the rest of the noise out because you can't really impact it anyway. And I think that's the approach all of us took.
That just triggers something. Did you ever meet Bryce Harlow?
Yes.
Tell us about him.
Only had one recollection. It was during the speech writing, the speeches for the vice president. Bill Sapphire had me go over one night and run it by Bryce Harlow, and I got to stand there at the edge of his desk and see him. And I mean, he was a legend. He was a legend.
So as the presidency continues, back to 1974,
Yeah.
as the presidency continues, do you notice a shift? I mean, by June, July, are things starting to change in the air?
Perhaps. I cannot tell you when the sense of inevitability would have set in. I think the smoking gun, that whole release of that. But that was one of the good things about having moved to the Domestic Council. When I was down in speechwriting and research, the TVs were on all the time, watching this stuff. Upstairs, we were still focused on what we had to do and developing policy, dealing with constituency groups, just very focused on all that.
Where were you on August 9th?
The day of the resignation. Well, the night before, I remember us all being there and having dinner in the mess, the White House mess, and then we couldn't leave to go back over because that's when they had closed down. I don't know if the president was moving around or whatever, but eventually then we moved back across the street, and very stark recollection of the crowds with their faces at the gates and the fences around the White House looking in. And it's the only time I ever worked there and felt like I was sort of an animal in a zoo because all the people there. The next day I was in the East Room when the president resigned. One of my early responsibilities on the research staff had been to be the keeper of the facts. Remember, I said we needed to have primary resources. The president, throughout his presidency, talked a lot about his early years growing up and his family and his mother making the lemon pies and selling them at the gas station, and the brother with the tuberculosis in Arizona. Well, I had to verify every one of those facts when that was put in a speech by a speechwriter. So we had the authorized biographies, and I would go to those and other, whatever primary sources we had. At any rate, sitting there in the East Room, listening to him speak, and his reference to his sainted mother, and I knew all these things. I remember I just had tears coming down my eyes, and it wasn't so much because I felt connected to the man personally as the human tragedy of it, and knowing as much as I did about where he came from and the hard life he had in his family, the fact that it all ended up this way. So we were there in the East Room, and then I was back in my office across the street watching the president being sworn in. And that's when it really hit me, because I think my naive impression had been, well, Richard Nixon was elected because people liked his policies, and we're doing his policies, so we'll just keep on doing what we were doing. What sitting in my chair watching a room full of strangers did was show me quite dramatically it's a new life. It's a new world. There's a new president. We don't know those people. They don't know us. We're nobody suddenly.
What was that first month like? There's a book about this. The first month of the Ford presidency, between August 9th, the resignation and the inauguration, and then the pardon, which is exactly 31 days later.
I wish I could tell you specifically. Again, I think it's human nature to focus on, at least at my point in life, focus on your own situation. And again, one of the best pieces of advice I was ever given was given by Jim Cavanaugh, who said, just keep your head down and keep doing your job. So for me, if Ken Cole was still running the domestic council at that point, it would have been business as usual. I'm sure we had work to do briefing the president and getting him up to speed, but I don't remember any of that. I more remember when the people came in from New York with Nelson Rockefeller, because remember he was named head of domestic policy, and Jim Cannon and Art Quern and Dick Parsons, who were just wonderful people.
What was that shift like?
Well, I'm sorry.
The shift with Vice President Rockefeller?
I
Because he
don't-
had some very definite ideas about.
Yes. But again, I don't remember his personal imprint as much as that of the people he brought with him. And that's where Jim Cannon was wonderful to work with. He had a great appreciation, and I learned a lot just in terms of writing from him. But how to present issues in a balanced way. And I remember it as a very positive, open time. Dick Parsons has obviously gone on to be the same person he was then. These were easygoing. There was a shift in tone. They were much more easygoing, interested in open processes. I think we had more groups in, much more outreach, openness to new ideas. And so it was a very exciting time to be part of the domestic council, the domestic policy team.
And you become assistant director later on, right?
Yeah.
Same portfolio, or?
Yes. And I can't remember when we were doing Social Security reform. Social Security reform, we still did health insurance. There were some really big health insurance issues at that point because the unemployment rate went up, and I remember we really were struggling with how do you address many of the same issues you see today. How do we address unemployment too? I think it was that at a time when there was the first recognition that African American youth had a much higher unemployment rate, and how do we deal with that? So again, very much more proactive sense of policy.
I do have to ask, did you wear your win button?
Yes. One of the responsibilities as the health policy person at the White House was to set up and accompany the various people that come to call on the president as a result of their affiliation with a health group. So that meant Raquel Welch, who was there with the American Cancer Society. I would propose the meeting to the president's scheduler and then would accompany her and the other people from the American Cancer Society into the Oval Office for the meeting with the president. And I distinctly remember a similar occasion wearing a win button and taking some celebrity in who wanted to call on the president wearing a win button.
If only Elvis had come back.
I know. I don't know. We took it very seriously.
Before we press on a little bit more with Ford and then on into the Reagan years, I want to ask you one last question about the Nixon years. Did you meet the president?
That's a really good question. I don't think I met the president when he was in the White House. I did meet the president, and have the picture to prove it, when he came to Philadelphia during the campaign, and I was in charge of the events for that day. No, it was a very structured White House. And remember, again, I was one of the youngest junior staffers.
Did you meet President Ford?
Yes, quite a bit.
What was he like?
Very natural, easygoing. Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, and because of the nature of the policy process, we had a lot of meetings with the president, with cabinet officers in the cabinet room on health policy issues. So I had both substantive meetings and then my accompanying these folks into the Oval Office for their pictures. And
What was the Raquel Welch meeting like?
well, I think Jim Cavanaugh was with me. We hosted her for lunch in the mess beforehand.
I can imagine there was a line too.
That was pretty funny. And yes, there were a lot of people there. And then when we came up from the mess, there was all of these people that just happened to be standing around that wanted to see her.
I was interning for Senator Lugar when Metallica came to testify on Napster, and there was I was walking by a hearing room, and there's 400 or 500 staffers just waiting with pen and paper.
I know. I think in the rest of the country, they look at people in Washington as being famous. When you're in Washington, you look at these celebrities from the rest of the world as being the ones you really want to see.
What was the 76 campaign like? Because
I was gone then. I left in 75.
Oh.
Moved to Chicago.
Oh, Chicago. That's
Yep.
a difference. Why did you leave?
Yeah. My husband at the time had a job there, and so that's why I did that.
Why do you come back? Well, actually, in 1980, when you go to Health and Human Services, and I guess this must have been an earlier connection for Secretary
Right.
Schweiker.
Right. Well, actually, during the 76 campaign, I had been approached by Jim Cavanaugh, who was now Deputy Chief of Staff, to do something on health care. I was chairing or working with a group. We were outside the administration, obviously, but I was working with him, and he had even talked about having me come back into the White House after the election. Well, the election was lost. But I stayed in touch and involved and got involved in the 80 campaign on the platform committee staff because I was in Detroit for 2 weeks staffing that. And in the course of being there and seeing people, I ran into Marty Anderson, who I had worked with. We had brought him in to help on health insurance when we were doing that in the Ford White House. And he got me involved somehow in the campaign and health policy. At any rate, Jim Cavanaugh then was made, did he head the transition?
He was
Appointees. Penn James, so he
Right.
got me involved so I, in the transition, was in charge of presidential appointments at HHS. So that's how I got to know Secretary Schweiker, and I interviewed all of the people and made recommendations for all the other presidential appointees. So Surgeon General Chick Coop, I was the first point of contact with him, and brought him down for an interview and maintained a long friendship with him ever since. At any rate, so that's how I got to know the secretary and all of that, and was working then at the White House on a part-time basis, continuing those appointments after January 20th when Secretary Schweiker asked me if I'd be willing to be the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs. He wanted to recommend that to the White House, so I agreed.
What did you feel like when you accepted the recommendation? This is going before the confirmation hearings. It's a visible spot.
It's a visible spot, and I'd really never dealt directly with the news media. But his chief of staff from the Senate was coming with him, and he was very experienced with the media. That was his background. So they assured me. It was, first of all, again, no sense of self-importance here. This was not one of the big controversial jobs. You know, it was not a policy job. It was a different direction for me. But it was great because the priorities of the administration, revising the budget, strengthening Social Security, the secretary came in with a very, very clear focus with FDA from his experience in the Senate working on that. It was a great, great opportunity.
You mentioned when you were in the agency being on the receiving end of OMB. What was it like looking at the White, because you'd been in the White House for years, you had this experience, and now you're out,
Yeah.
You're a full appointee, you have a confirmation.
Yeah.
What was the difference like?
I remember budget meetings in the department, days and days and days of budget meetings, and having to deal with OMB's requirements that certain programs be cut. What was really difficult was being on the receiving end then of the leaks and opening the paper and finding that HHS wants to cut Head Start by X%, or children's welfare programs. I mean, really dramatic examples of budget cuts that could hurt different constituencies. And having to deal with that, it might be a leak to advance a particular agenda, but it fell to us to have to explain. And so it was a very controversial time, and there was a lot of controversy at that point about the defense budget compared to the budget at HHS. But fortunately, Secretary Schweiker, having been a senator, understood the importance of communicating clearly the most important points, and he was a great one to work for. He had a big chart that we took around to all the speeches he gave when he would demonstrate that we were spending much more than the Defense Department.
Did you ever counter leak or try to track down the leakers?
No, you just cope.
How do you come back into the White House?
Secretary Schweiker left. Secretary Heckler was coming in. Dave Gergen was at the White House. And he approached me because they wanted to have someone with a strategic communications focus. And that is what I had worked on in particular at the end of the Nixon administration, when we were keeping our eye on what the president was doing domestically, trying to line up events and communications opportunities to show the American public that we were still focused on what we needed to work on. So he asked me if I would come to the White House and do that, and I was ready to make a move.
How did the Reagan communications apparatus differ, or how was it the same? Compare and contrast.
Oh, well, first of all, I'm at a different level. So you had Dave there, and you had Mike Deaver. And you had Dick Darman, who really understood communications and visual. So it was terrific. I mean, there was a real sense of total strategic communications, both events, visually, by speech, by deed, by policy. And it was much more mature and well-rounded than Nixon, but I think to a great extent you can look back at the Nixon presidency as the first presidency that focused on the importance of communication in a strategic way. Now, and I was on a different end of it. I wasn't on the speechwriting end.
Right.
I was on the
right.
policy. Well, coordinating cabinet departments initially, and then starting the Office of Strategic Communications under Mike Deaver.
And then you stayed there for 2 years, a year and a half?
I left in '85 and went with Mike Deaver at his firm when he left. Yeah, mid-'85. So I worked initially for Dave Gergen, and then when he left, I was handed over to Mike Deaver.
What was the atmosphere of the Reagan
Now,
White House
wait a minute.
like?
You have to, for
sorry.
history, I have to tell you this one thing. When Dave asked me to come over there, I was pregnant at that point with my 4th child, I guess. And this was an era where presidential appointees didn't have children and stay. They left. So I didn't know, so I didn't tell him I was pregnant. I accepted the job. And then I said I needed to take maternity leave in August.
What was his reaction?
Oh, he was fine. He was fine. Dave's always been very progressive. But I just wanted to be certain. Because it's hard to imagine, and I tell this to my daughters now, but you couldn't assume that maternity leave was something even the federal government would give you.
Well, of course, that has actually recently changed, I guess.
Yeah.
I want to ask about the atmosphere, just briefly, because you've worked in 3 presidents' White Houses. The atmosphere of the Reagan White House, especially, of course, compared to the Nixon White House.
Yeah. Well, the Nixon White House, particularly at the level I was in, was a pretty intense chain of command. And when you're at the bottom of the chain, you're on the receiving end a lot. And in the research office, for example, there'd be things where, we'd be told, Haldeman or somebody that worked for him wanted to know, how many hands did the president shake in the first year in office? We need to know by 12:30. And it was up to us to produce. And if you didn't produce, you'd get a call at 12:33. Where is it? So there was very much a sense of chain of command there. In the Reagan White House, I didn't have that sense at all. Very different feel.
What were your experiences with President Reagan?
Delightful. I mean, just as nice. And I remember he was doing an interview on Good Morning America on education, I guess, and Dave had given me the opportunity to write the briefing memo for him and the talking points and the messages we wanted him to deliver, and then took me into the Oval Office to brief him beforehand. And as soon as the president saw me, the first thing he wanted to do was thank me for doing all that hard work for him. And here's a man who people do hard work for him every single day all over the country and all over the Washington, and the fact that that's what he wanted to tell me when he saw me. I've never forgotten that. Very, very thoughtful, kind person.
We were joking earlier that Good Morning America is the other GMA.
That's right. It's the GMA I always knew until I came here.
Do you have any other reflections or thoughts on your time, in the Nixon and Ford White Houses? Any stories we didn't get down? Anything you want to preserve
Yeah,
for
I'm
history?
trying to think. I think what's probably common among any White House is it is, and a couple of things. You have to always remember you're only there temporarily. Never take it so seriously that it's not a career. It's temporary. And at the end of the day, whoever works there is under enormous pressure, and it's very hard work. And so I don't care who the president is and what the party is. Anyone that works there has my respect, because it's a very serious thing. And at the end of the day, it's still a job. And you can say that you're never going to take for granted the opportunity, and you can mean that. But again, at the end of the day, it's who you're working with, the sense of satisfaction you get from your work, the people, the personalities that make the difference.
I would ask just 2 final questions, and the first one actually comes from the Courtney Fleming interview.
Okay.
You have a speechwriting retreat at Camp David in March '73.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that and about the guest book at the, must have been Laurel Lodge?
Yes. Well, this was part of doing business as usual, and so the election's over, and Dave wants to take us all to the next level of effectiveness and team building, and it's great. We do a staff retreat to Camp David in March, and it's a great time. I remember swimming outdoors in the president's pool and the sauna and everything, and there's a guest book there in the lodge, and at one point, I guess we were signing it, I noticed, I guess we all noticed, I can't remember now, that John Dean had signed the guest book recently. And it's sort of, oh, it's interesting. Gosh, wonder what he was doing up here. And again, it's like, so does he hang out at Camp David with the president on the weekends? And then later, of course, this visit to Camp David became one of such notoriety.
And then the last question has to do, and it's something we alluded to a little bit off camera. We were talking about Barbara Franklin and her role. But of course, when you join the White House, it is the early 70s. This is a very male-dominated profession. At the apex, of course, it's a very male-dominated profession. But you've been in Washington now off and on for a few years. What was it like for you starting off in that environment compared to someone similar today? And what's it been like for you specifically in your career?
Good question. When I came back to look for a job after I graduated from college, I was referred to presidential personnel, and somebody there was talking to me about a job that basically was a secretarial job. There was an older woman who was a secretary, and that's what those jobs were called in those days, who pulled me aside into another room and said, "Whatever you do not let them make you a secretary. You will never get out of it." Well, you're talking to someone who went to college thinking she was going to get married, work for a few years, and then get married. This was an era when things changed. Now, for the record, I've worked my entire life other than maternity leave, so my career went very differently because of this White House experience. So I owe a lot to that woman, because if she had not given me that advice, I probably would have quite happily gone along with whatever job presidential personnel wanted to give me. That being said, we were the only non-secretarial women on the White House staff for a long time. Now, Bobby Kilberg had been there originally, but she was gone at that point. And I think there was somebody doing aging policy, a woman that had come in. But for the
Virginia Nauer?
No, she was consumer.
Right.
But, and they really didn't know what to do with us. We were paid on the secretarial scale level, which I had words with Dave Gergen about at one point, because Haldeman wouldn't give us a salary increase. But because we were women, we were on the women's salary track, which was secretarial. When I went in the Ford administration then, and I was attending the daily senior staff meetings, I was the only woman. Now, once the Rockefeller people came in, I think there were some women that came down from New York, but for the most part, I was the only woman in those meetings. And I was a young woman, and I certainly did not see myself as equals to Tom Karologos, you know, all those other people. So I will say it was not easy in terms of understanding who I was and that I was a peer of these men. On the other hand, I don't think I ever once felt a sense of discrimination from them. And I owe a lot. I mean, they treated me as peers, they respected me, they respected my work. Jim Kavanaugh gave me total responsibility to deal with these cabinet officers, to coordinate this working group of Alan Greenspan and the Secretary of the Cabinet. So it was a tremendous sense of opportunity, but it never would have happened if that woman had not told me to turn down the secretary job. So I tell this to my daughters, because what a different place now. You know. Yeah.
Ms. Bailey?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Good, thank you. Enjoyed it.
If we could just sit here quietly for 30 seconds.